Thank you very much, Joe. I hope our Northern Hemisphere friends are enjoying seeing how we're learning down here. We've been inspired by your lead, and some wonderful people are doing fabulous work adapting Passive House and reaping the benefits in their own environments. Now we're heading back to the Northern Hemisphere, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Lloyd Alter, editor, writer, and adjunct professor. We're in for a treat, joining Lloyd in a fireside chat with Kyle Hanson, who's the founder and CEO of Timber Age Systems. Over to you, Lloyd.
It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is really quite remarkable. I'm actually in Paris at a Building and Climate UN conference that I was asked to come to at the last minute. And this morning, someone described it as the Woodstock of building and climate because so many people are here. But what you're doing here, this is so marvelous that you're going around the world. And here are three of us talking from Auckland. I'm in Paris. And Kyle, you're where?
I'm in Durango, Colorado, Lloyd. Yeah,
Durango,
it is amazing.
Colorado. Yes, it's amazing. We're covering 12 time zones and like right around the world like this, doing this marvelous, marvelous thing. I wish I could have watched more of it. And
What were you
Kyle
doing?
and
What were you doing, Lloyd? Are you sleeping, or I mean, what's
right? Yeah, that's right. I was speaking actually, but anyhow, I first met Kyle at a conference, a Passive House conference in Denver, Colorado in the fall. And I went into this seminar really skeptical. I thought, this does not make sense using cross-laminated timber for little buildings like this. And I was all set to ask all of these questions. And the more that I watched Kyle and the more that I listened to what he was actually doing, I thought, this is really brilliant. This is actually so sensible. And so now that I've given that introduction, Kyle, describe to our audience what exactly you do at Timber Age.
Okay. Well, thanks for that introduction, Lloyd. It's a pleasure to be visiting with you. At Timber Age, our elevator pitch is that we make durable, high-performance, off-site manufactured homes. And the thing that's unique about it is that we use locally harvested timber to build the homes. So that's the quick elevator pitch. Our mission is elevating communities through innovative materials and methods which transform the ways we design and build. So one of the things you'll notice is in our mission, it really has nothing to do particularly with mass timber. It doesn't mention Passive House, but I think all of us that have been around the world and start to understand what the built environment needs realize the value of Passive House. And for us, mass timber has a specific value because of where we live. As an aside, as an individual, just one of my personal work goals is to try and create 1,000 fulfilling jobs before I die. And so they intersect obviously a little bit.
Well, we're here in the section talking about climate resilience and wildfire crisis. So can you describe what you do, where you get your wood that is relevant to this subject?
Yeah, absolutely. So I live in Durango, Colorado, which is really the southern edge of kind of the Rockies as they die for a period of time and then they pop back up in New Mexico. So everything north and west of Durango is mountainous terrain, and there's a ponderosa pine belt that runs around much of Colorado. And oddly enough, ponderosa pine was, logged pretty heavily throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s as the area was settled, and then it really went out of vogue, and people stopped using ponderosa pine, and so now we have second growth forests that have never been touched, and all the forest fires have been put out. And so what we're faced with is we have lots of people wanting to move to an area where the forest is right on the edge of most of our urban development. And so we have that wild and urban interface that stretches around much of this region and much of the communities, the rural communities like where we're at. And the sad thing is that ponderosa pine is this really kind of amazing wildfire adapted tree that self-prunes so the branches stay up high and has this amazing bark that doesn't get bothered too much if a wildfire runs through in the understory. But because we've not let the fire evolve the forests, we end up with these forests that are super tightly packed. And so instead of growing out and getting lots of photosynthetic area, the trees grow up and they're very stressed. They don't make as much pitch. And all of a sudden, they're much more susceptible to disease in the form of beetles and those kinds of things, and especially catastrophic wildfire, because when we have fire events now, it jumps up into the canopy and it runs across the canopy and we get really high tree mortality. So we were like, if we know that the Forest Service and other forest stewards really want to be able to take some of the fiber out of the woods and there's nowhere to put it except for in decks on the ground or in firewood, we can basically say if someone doesn't do something with the wood, it's either going to be digested by bacteria and end up in the atmosphere as CO2, or it's going to be burned and end up in the atmosphere as CO2. If there was a way for us to be able to sequester some of that in the higher quality dwellings, it seems like a pretty neat opportunity for us.
So in other parts of the world where there's a constant argument about cross-laminated timber, about, the state of the forests, are we taking too much? Should we be leaving the trees there to photosynthesize and absorb carbon dioxide? You're in a different situation. You're actually taking out wood that has to be removed so that the forest actually survives and stays healthy. You're taking, I won't call it, it's not a waste product in a sense, but you're doing good for that particular forest right there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's an interesting thing because if we'd never been here, fire would have moved through, and these trees wouldn't have survived evolution. So it's just an interesting thing, and for us to be able to say, well, we could just burn all of it, but we have this amazing opportunity to be able to turn it into high quality, high efficiency housing. It seems like a win-win, especially if we can create, and the neat thing about passive houses is how long the buildings last. We have a housing crisis here where the median home price, and so it's very difficult for us to have teachers or public servants that can stick around in our community for longer than a year or two. There's a tremendous amount of churn, and so our community is very transient. And there's a lot of kind of the fabric of society that I think comes from public servants being anchored and able to contribute and really invest in their community. It's difficult to do if you can't create high quality housing. And unfortunately right now, the stuff that we're building, is the cheapest code minimum stuff that will have a hard time lasting as long as the mortgage.
Right. Now, most cross-laminated timber, as people watching might know, was developed in Austria, where they took dimensioned lumber, like, say, 2x6s, and they laminate them one against the other with special glues in giant presses, and when Katera was in business and they built their CLT plant in Oregon, I think they spent $150 million on that plant. I may be underestimating. That may have been their estimate. It might have been higher. And you take a totally different approach. The lamstock, which is what they call the wood that gets pressed into the CLT, is completely different. And the way you put it together is interesting. And this may be a little nerdy and technical, because I don't know if everybody watching this understands how CLT is normally made. But can you describe your process and your facilities and how this differs from the rest of the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the learning points is if you've never read the book, The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, it's a great book about the scientific method and the idea that we're trying to do things that give us the cheapest, fastest, easiest way to be able to test a hypothesis. And back to your point, I think that the jury is out on whether or not mass timber makes sense in every single situation. But for us, we just knew that no one was using ponderosa pine, and that if we were able to use a smaller board, so like the smallest board that we use is 1 inch by 3.5 inches. And so we can take trees down to 8 inches and still get boards out of it that are able for us to be used. But what that really kind of says is everything is being pressed to a smaller, more community scale approach. And one of the main reasons is I worked in a large wood processing facility, and oftentimes the reason why the forest isn't healthy is because we're trying to treat it at a scale that everyone can't agree with. And we realized that if we would do manufacturing at a smaller scale, then we could become partners with most of the stakeholders in the conversation, which is the Forest Service and the environmental lobby and the people that we're providing jobs for, and the community that's benefiting from high quality housing that's more affordable than what the market has to offer.
Yeah, as background, I should explain one of the things that Kyle mentioned, that I've always had an objection to using cross-laminated timber on 1- and 2-story buildings because CLT has 5 times the amount of wood fiber as building out of traditional 2x4 construction. And so my immediate reaction when I looked at what Timber Age was doing, what started me off on the wrong foot, was I said, they're using wood 5 times as much fiber as they need to use. But then what you turned it all on its head is you want to use the fiber in this case. You're finding a place for all this wood that's got to be taken out of the forest, and you're building a durable, beautiful wall. And now that since we're halfway through our time and we're at a Passive House conference, can you explain how you take the CLT wall, which doesn't have very much of an R value, and turn it into a Passive House wall?
Absolutely. So I think that was the other thing that I realized is as I was learning about Passive House, this idea of all of these temperature gradients, right, has placed so much into the effectiveness of an assembly. So one of the really neat things about cross-laminated timber is we normally have to manage all of these basically, thermal bridges that we do when we do stud construction. The neat thing about CLT is the wood has a hydrothermal buffering capacity, and it also has low vapor permeance. And so it forms the interior piece. We start with this buffering thing that has some thermal mass, and so it can actually do temperature shifting as we go through the day. Then we just in case kind of belt suspenders, we do an air and vapor control barrier on the back of the CLT as we're moving towards the exterior. And then we've got a void that we create that allows us to add structure. It's essentially a Larson truss design. So we're doing standoffs, and that's filled with dense packed cellulose. And then we finish with the appropriate vapor open and water vapor at WRB on the outside. And then typically we're using a range screen approach. If we're doing a flat roof, obviously we would move to a little bit different approach in terms of vapor permeance as we went through the membranes.
And what do you usually use for your exterior cladding, having been to Colorado after the Hanson fire and seeing everybody using non-combustible outer cladding? What do you use usually?
We've used a variety of things, and often we say it's finish ready on the inside, it's cladding ready on the outside, the panels that we're shipping. But for some folks that are worried about being maybe in a wildland urban interface, we're pre-installing cement board so that they can do stucco. And then we've got, the insect screen is also spark arresting on the bottoms. That's one of the things we're worried about. The rain screen, just don't want to be pulling sparks up there. So we're excited. Actually, the Durango Fire Department was like, "Hey, we've got this fire room, and if you guys want to build a mock-up, we'd love to burn it." So we're actually looking forward to doing that. And the next year is just building an assembly that is stucco and the rest of it. Because our hypothesis is that we may be able to have a fire event and you simply would just do some repair to the exterior skeleton of it. But structurally, we wouldn't really lose the ability to support the house. So it's kind of exciting to think about. So it's 12 inches of dense packed cellulose. So it's R52 as kind of a starting point all the way around the shell. And depending on the climate zone, we can change the R value of the roof to make sure that it matches whatever the model requires.
Okay, we're just about out of time. So I wanted to ask, you started off with your vision to hire 1,000 people, and why don't you finish off with telling us where you are right now, what you're building right now, and any final comments or thoughts that you would like to express?
Okay, thanks, Lloyd. Well, so I love manufacturing because it creates fulfilling jobs if it's done in a healthy environment. And I think that if there's a compelling vision, it's a neat way to give people steady work. And so in a place that's seasonal, like where I live, it's an important thing. So right now we have 9 team members, but the most exciting thing is we were just awarded a $680,000 grant from the state of Colorado. And then we were in a competitive loan process called the factory loan process. So we were just awarded $3.8 million at some really, really kind of amazing interest rates for us to be able to consolidate and build our first full-scale factory. So over the next year, we'll be building our first full-scale factory that's a model, and it's designed to be replicable really anywhere in the world in terms of the way that it would be approached. And it's at a scale that I think would always be in balance with local forests. And our idea is we don't make the factory bigger, we just add more factories so that there's a degree of community accountability that's always associated with the operation of our factories. So we're excited to try and, can we plant 20 or 30 more factories around the United States, around North America in the next 10 years, and then who knows where it goes from there.
Well, I came into Denver really skeptical about what you were doing, and I left Denver, and now I'm sort of leaving our conversation with me in Paris, really impressed with how you're making so much sense out of saving the forest, improving the forest, and building great stuff. And congratulations on what you do, Kyle.
Thanks so much, Lloyd. Without people that are knowledgeable and influential like yourself telling our story, it wouldn't happen. So I appreciate it.
Okay. Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. I see there's been a bit of chat there. People very impressed at you joining us, I think in the middle of the night, your time. So thank you for joining us from Paris, and thank you to Kyle as well. Thank you also for getting nerdy and technical. We like that on the Passive House Accelerator. But also for having such a great vision, Kyle, for communities, not just in the valuable work that you're providing for people, but also what you're creating and what others have created. I'd like to thank the other speakers from this hour, Jesse Clark and